Continuing with ethos, we have two kinds of ethical proofs. Those two kinds of ethical proofs are, number one, situated, and number two, invented. Now, this is something I've mentioned to you before, so I'll review it for a minute. Invented doesn't have anything to do with trickery or flattery or deception at all. It is the ethos that you create within a piece of discourse. And there are a variety of ways that you create that ethos. Now, we're going to spend the majority of our time on invented ethos. And that's because situated ethos is your reputation. Within a piece of discourse, when you're composing a speech or a composition, you can't create or invent a reputation there. You already have one. It may be a good reputation, it may be a bad reputation, it may be relatively obscure. Your audience may not know you or may not know you well, but you do have a reputation. Your invented ethos is found within the discourse itself, as we said. So with situated ethos, there are certain ways that can be used and so on, but we would talk about that more in an advanced rhetoric class. We won't spend time on that in this lecture. If you are, however, mindful of the reputation you bring to the table, if you're aware of what your audience thinks of you in advance, then you can overcome blemishes or detractions or negatives in your reputation. You can do that. Now, you might think that this would involve some kind of deceit or flattery or trickery, and Pastor, you just said you weren't going to be promoting that kind of thing. Well, I'm not promoting sophistry at all. Certainly, you can use deceit, just as you can use rhetoric in an unethical way. But I want you to think about some other things that impact your ethos. Now, I want to say this, first of all, that not every negative mark on your reputation is the product of a character flaw. I'm preparing this lecture in particular for my college class, and that means that I'm speaking primarily to young college students. In many rhetorical situations, what you have to overcome is not a character flaw. It's not bad character. It's just the fact that you're young and inexperienced and your audience doesn't know much about you and you haven't accomplished much in your life yet. You'll have to consider this as you prepare your discourse. The fact that you're young and inexperienced. The fact that people look at you that way. Young men who in college get up to speak, to preach in a church, necessarily are faced with the fact that they are young and inexperienced and people may not respect them. If that's the case, what can you do? Well, that's where invented ethos comes into play. There are ways to overcome the disadvantage of your youth and inexperience. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but when you're young, it is especially important, for instance, that you address your audience with respect. It's important that you do your homework and that be evident. It be evident that you did your homework. It's important that you give careful attention to your arrangement, that you be organized in your delivery, whether it's spoken or written. You don't want your audience thinking that he's bouncing off the walls and chasing every rabbit that runs in front of his path, because it's a turnoff in young people especially. An old man who's been preaching for 50 years and rabbit trails a little bit or a lot can get away with it. The college student, not so much. It's also important, and something for you to think about, especially young men, important for you to avoid the kind of brashness that is common among young people. Old men are disgusted by the brashness of youth. There is a time and there is a place for you to speak firmly and directly to an issue. but you also do need to remember your place. Now, that being said, there are 3 qualities necessary to a good ethos. This is somewhat review. You might remember earlier we pointed out 3 mistakes of ethos. The first mistake being that of being or seeming to be uninformed. The second, having bad moral character. And the third, having a lack of goodwill for the audience. Now, you might be thinking, well, but your bad moral character, you already said that's either there or it's not there. Your character is already established when you come to the situation. Well, that's true. But within a rhetorical situation, within a speech or a composition, you also put your character on display. And because you're prepared ahead of time, you have the ability to neutralize perhaps some perceived character flaws. Surprise your audience with what you have to say and how you say it. The mistakes of ethos are corrected by, if I can remind you again, by being or seeming to be intelligent. Notice I say seeming to be. Of good moral character, and by having goodwill towards your audience. So, there's some review. Let's use that as a springboard into the meat of ethos. Now, nobody springboards into meat. You might dive into meat with your fork and knife, but you would springboard into the swimming pool of ethos. Just sounds odd to say the swimming pool of ethos, but I digress. First thing we do is we demonstrate intelligence by doing our homework. See, that's the thing. You don't have to be the smartest kid in the class. You can work the hardest. You can study. You can prepare so that what you say is intelligent because you've done your homework. See, this is the thing. The best way to sound informed is to be informed. No shortcuts. No shortcuts. I say that to college kids, understanding that I'm speaking primarily to college students. There are no shortcuts. Stop trying to find them. There's no quick, easy path to success. You work hard. And the same goes if you want to be an effective speaker or an effective writer. It's hard work. That's why people don't like it. It's hard work. You have to work at it. If anybody tells you that writing is easy, they're probably trying to sell you a manual on writing. All right? If anybody tells you that public speaking is easy, now watch out. Put your hands in your pockets, hold on to your wallet, because the guy's probably trying to rook you here. Know what you're talking about. Do you know how to know what you're talking about? Study. That's how. Again, nobody likes that, but that's the truth. You know, when you study, when you do your homework, when you know what you're talking about, your audience feels respected. You make them feel respected. And for a good reason, too. Because you demonstrate that you respect them because you did the homework. If you didn't respect them, you'd just speak off the cuff. You'd flatter them. You'd sound like you were saying something when you're saying nothing. Now, within a speech or a written composition, an essay, and so on, within a speech, remember the 6 parts of discourse. The first is the introduction. The second is the statement of facts, or the narratio. Your statement of facts sets the table for this impression that you are intelligent. When you give the right background information, when you avoid misrepresenting facts or jumping to conclusions, when you give the relevant facts without talking down to your audience or treating them like they're ignoramuses. So a careful narratio, a careful statement of facts, is an essential part of of making this good impression, of sounding intelligent. Now, this also requires you to do your homework on your audience, and you do need to study your audience. Know how informed your audience is. If you start out over your audience's head they'll stop listening. So you need to have a general idea of how much or how familiar your audience is with your topic. This is not limited to the narratio either. Throughout the discourse, it should be evident that you know what you're talking about. This brings up an important part of stasis theory. It's also why stasis theory is important, because if all you do is research, all you do then is depend on other people's thoughts on the subject you're going to speak about. See, stasis theory is not research. Stasis theory is what I think your composition teacher probably would call it brainstorming, where you write down your ideas. The difference is, when I was in college, I remember even high school, my teacher said you need to have one sheet of paper and just write down every idea. I'd sit there and write down stuff, and what am I going to do with this? Every idea. Stasis theory organizes those brainstorming ideas. It makes you think, it forces you to think in certain patterns and directions. And what stasis theory does is it forces you to think through, do the hard work of thinking through the issue. Thinking is some of the hardest work known to mankind. That's why many people prefer to do work that requires little or no thought. But I'll also say that an audience appreciates a speaker or writer who has obviously thought things through and thought them through fairly. Now, the second thing, so the first thing again is that we need to show that we're intelligent, and we do that by doing the homework. Secondly, we establish good moral character in a certain way. The ancients argued that we establish good moral character by describing ourselves or others as moral persons and by refraining from the use of misleading or fallacious arguments. Sharon Crowley includes an example from Cicero. Give me a second and I'll read it to you. Cicero said, Cicero was accused of having a double standard. He was defending a certain person, Lucius Murena, and he was accused of this double standard, that he held other men to a higher standard, but his own client he let off the hook. In response, Cicero said, "I have always gladly shown the restraint and forgiveness which nature herself has taught me. I have not been eager to wear the mask of dead seriousness and hardness, but I wore it willingly when the crisis of state and the solemn requirements of my office demanded. If then when the Republic wanted force and uncompromising severity, I overcame my nature to become as ruthless as I was forced into being, not as I wished, may I not now respond to the sympathetic and humane qualities which all the motives in the case prompt in me and accord them my characteristic degree of energy and enthusiasm?" Now that's an example of Cicero essentially praising himself without praising himself. He's defending himself, but he's attempting to do it in a way that doesn't sound arrogant. That's a part of what the ancients taught, that to establish good moral character, you needed to praise yourself without arrogance. As Christians, we must be very careful about this sort of thing. There is certainly a time and a place and occasion to say, I'm not the man that my opponents say that I am. That in fact what I've done here is in your best interest. But we also need to understand that there is a humility that amounts to hypocrisy. There also is a self-denigrating sense of humor that can actually set an audience at ease and lets them know that you do not think of yourself more highly than you ought to. Now, Jack Benny was a comedian, and his whole shtick was making fun of himself. Ronald Reagan was an expert at this kind of self-denigrating kind of humor. You always got the impression from Reagan that he did not think more highly of himself. He had a good perspective of his place in history. But here's the catch. with any of these things, you have to pass the sincerity test. Fake humility always has a certain odor to it that gives it away. Just the same as if a beef crawled up under your refrigerator and died. Pretty soon it would be given away by the smell. The best way to establish good moral character in a piece of discourse is to have good moral character. Again, no shortcuts. No shortcuts. If you have good moral character, it will show up in your speaking and in your writing. But I'll add that if you're a sincere person, then you do have the opportunity in your speaking and in your writing to sound human to your audience. And we identify with humans. We identify with people as opposed to robots or self-righteous demigods. You'll observe throughout your life that the more hard-hearted a person is, the more thin-skinned that person will be. Now, regardless of your calling, as a disciple of Jesus Christ, you must learn to be thick-skinned and tender-hearted. Now, there are some things that will improve your moral standing with your audience, will improve on the moral character that you appear to have. The first thing is to back up your facts and opinions with citations and references from established and respected authorities. Let it be known that I'm not the only one who thinks this. Unless, of course, you are the only one who thinks it, and if you are, then you should say so. Don't just spout. Don't just spout. That's a temptation for young people. Don't just spout. Whale spout. My wife and I were just recently, when we were in San Diego, we went on a whale watching cruise. And after an hour, we finally saw a whale. You know what the guide said? "Oh, I just saw a spout." She didn't actually even see the whale. She just saw the spout. We kept looking at the spout. I know that you can see whales sometimes on whale watching expeditions. I just saw spouting and a fin one time. A whale can spout. What else can you do? That's a question that you should ask yourself. For that matter, oil wells and sewers spout from time to time as well. Don't spout. Refrain from unfair tactics in your speech and in your writing. Avoid logical fallacies, ad hominem attacks, hasty generalizations, oversimplifying the choices, mischaracterizing or misrepresenting your opponents or their positions, and so forth. Those kinds of things will be instantly apparent to your audience, and it is a turnoff. It shows poor character on your part. Audiences know what red herrings smell like, even if they can't tell you what a red herring is. Doing the homework enhances your audience's perception of your character. Again, if it's evident that you did your homework, then that to the audience, that sounds like good moral character. Diligence, of course, is a mark of good moral character. The third thing is, just reviewing. Number one, you need to sound intelligent. You do that by doing the homework. The second is that you need to have good moral character, and that needs to be evident in your speech. Thirdly, we achieve goodwill towards our audience. We demonstrate goodwill towards our audience really in a lot of these same ways. Cicero recommended, if we refer to our own acts and services without arrogance, if we weaken the effect of charges that have been preferred, or of some suspicion of less honorable dealing which has been cast upon us, if we dilate on the misfortunes which have befallen us, or the difficulties which still beset us, if we use prayers and entreaties with a humble and submissive spirit, he said, then, he concluded, we will demonstrate goodwill towards our audience. Of course, the idea of commending ourselves sounds repulsive to Christians. Yet when we speak of ourselves, we do need to be careful that we don't sound arrogant. The truth is, when you've done the homework, treated the issue fairly, refrained from insulting your audience's intelligence or imposing unwarranted opinions on them, spouting. If you've showed yourself to be a good guy, you demonstrate goodwill. Remember again our mantra, no shortcuts. No shortcuts. Keep that in mind. Repeat it to yourself. You achieve goodwill towards your audience, get this, by having goodwill towards your audience, by wanting what is best for them. This is true even when your audience is set against you. Would you consider with me the Apostle Paul? Think about him standing before the people of Israel, pleading with them to believe the gospel. The time when Paul's nephew came and warned him of the plot against him and so on. Remember, Paul stood in Acts 22. Why don't you look at it? Acts 22. Read the first 22 verses of Acts 22. I won't read it for the sake of time. Pause this and read it. Did you read it? I hope so. Notice that Paul does exactly what Cicero recommended. He spoke of himself without arrogance. He identifies with the Jewish people. He reminds them that he was once one of them, a Pharisee, persecuting Christians, hating Jesus Christ of Nazareth. He points out the way he distinguished himself by persecuting the kind of people that he has now become. He, in a sense, he identifies with his audience. He explains the way his former lifestyle and identity with the very people who were persecuting him now made him want to avoid doing what he was now doing. Obviously, in this case, Paul was standing in front of a very hostile audience. And yet, Paul, by his ethos, gave himself the very best opportunity to reach these people. This is important because we can learn how to establish good ethos within a discourse from the example of Paul, here and in other places as well. All right, that's all about considering yourself. Remember the three things that we have to consider in ethos. 1, you consider yourself. 2, you consider your appearance. 3, you consider your language. We're going to talk about considering your appearance for a moment next.